Two warriors, two legends, two completely different worlds, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, mountains, and centuries of completely isolated history. One painted his face and sailed into storms on ships that shouldn't have survived. The other shaved his head and trained from the age of 5 to become a living weapon wrapped in silk and iron. They never met. They never could have met. And yet, here we are, asking the question that has haunted history nerds, martial artists, game designers, and late-night Reddit threads for decades if a Viking and a samurai somehow faced each other on neutral ground. No armies, no allies, no reinforcements, just one man against the other. Who walks away? This isn't going to be a simple answer, because nothing about either of these warriors is simple. We're going to dig into the weapons, the armor, the psychology, the training, the physical conditioning, the philosophy of combat, and even the biology of violence itself. We're going to look at real historical records, actual combat tests, and the accounts of people who survived fighting both types of warriors. And by the end of this video, you're going to have an answer. A real one, not a cop-out. They're both amazing answer, but a cold, honest, historically grounded verdict. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the men themselves. The Viking warrior existed roughly between 793 AD and 1066 AD. We know the dates because history gave us clean bookmarks. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in northern England opened the Viking Age with fire and screaming monks, and the Battle of Hastings quietly closed it when Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, took an arrow through the throat in Norway before William the Conqueror even got to England. In those 2.5 centuries, Norse warriors from Scandinavia terrorized 4 continents. They raided England, France, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. They sailed up rivers into Russia and established trade routes that reached Constantinople. They discovered Iceland, Greenland, and North America, 500 years before Columbus was born. These were not primitive savages living in mud huts. These were sophisticated, brutal, extraordinarily adaptable warriors who happened to also be farmers, merchants, poets, and explorers. The samurai existed as a formal warrior class from roughly 900 AD all the way to 1868, when the Meiji Restoration abolished the caste system and modernized Japan. That's nearly 1,000 years of continuous martial tradition. The word samurai itself comes from the Japanese verb saburo, meaning to serve. These were men born into service, specifically military service to a lord, a clan, a system of honor so rigid and absolute that breaking it could only be resolved by opening your own stomach with a knife in a formalized ritual suicide called seppuku. Think about that for a second. The code of honor was so serious that the penalty for violating it was self-disembowelment. These were not people who took combat casually. Now let's talk about size and physical conditioning, because this matters and most people get it wrong. The popular image of a Viking is a massive, barrel-chested giant who could wrestle a bear. The popular image of a samurai is a lean, precise, almost delicate figure, moving like water. Both of these images are partially true and massively oversimplified. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian burial sites shows that Viking men averaged about 5 feet 9 inches tall, significantly above average for medieval Europeans, who typically stood around 5 feet 5 or 5 feet 6. Some warriors were considerably larger. The famous Viking chieftain Egil Skallagrimsson, documented in the Icelandic sagas, was described as having a skull so thick that an axe couldn't crack it, which was actually tested after his skeleton was exhumed in the 19th century, and his skull was indeed abnormally dense. Viking warriors built their bodies through real physical labor, rowing for days across open ocean, farming in brutal Nordic winters, wrestling, fighting practice called glima, and actual combat from adolescence onward. Samurai physical conditioning was equally extreme, but approached differently. Japanese men of the warrior class averaged around 5 feet 3 to 5 feet 5 inches during the feudal period, smaller than Vikings by several inches on average. But height is not the same as lethality. Samurai trained in multiple martial arts simultaneously: kenjutsu for sword technique, jujutsu for grappling, kyujutsu for archery, and various weapon-specific disciplines. Their training began in early childhood and continued without interruption until death. The physical conditioning of a mature samurai was exceptional, not in raw bulk, but in explosive speed, precision, and endurance specific to sword fighting. Their sword arm strength in particular would have been phenomenal, because a katana requires not brute force, but controlled, razor-precise muscular technique applied at exactly the right moment. So already we have an interesting contrast, the Viking likely bigger, heavier, with raw strength, built for variable combat in unpredictable environments. The samurai likely faster, more technically refined, with a much longer and more systematized martial education. But we haven't talked about the weapons yet, and the weapons are where this gets genuinely fascinating. The Vikings' primary weapons were the axe, the sword, and the spear. The Norse sword, the type archaeologists call the Carolingian or Viking sword, was a double-edged, pattern-welded blade, typically between 70 and 90 centimeters long. It was designed to cut through and around shields, to deliver powerful slashing blows, and to be used effectively in a shield wall where space was limited. The blade was not particularly flexible. It was made for raw cutting power. The Viking axe is perhaps more culturally iconic. The broad-bladed Dane axe could be swung in sweeping arcs that few shields could stop, and it gave enormous reach advantage. Archaeological testing on replica Viking axes has shown they can generate enough force to cut through a padded gambeson, chainmail, and into bone in a single strike. The Viking also carried a round wooden shield, typically about 80 centimeters in diameter, rimmed with iron, which was both a defensive and offensive weapon. It could be punched forward to stun an enemy or control the engagement. The samurai's primary weapon was the katana, but calling it simply a sword is like calling a Formula One car a vehicle. The katana is arguably the most technically sophisticated edged weapon ever produced by human hands. The steel used, called tamahagane, was folded and worked thousands of times to create a blade with a hard cutting edge and a softer, flexible spine. This differential hardening, produced through a clay coating process during quenching, created a blade that could hold an edge sharp enough to split a silk scarf falling through the air, while simultaneously absorbing the shock of combat without shattering. The geometry of the katana, its curve, its weight distribution, its specific cross-section, is optimized for one thing: a single, devastatingly powerful cutting stroke delivered at maximum speed. The draw cut, called iai jutsu, is a technique where the katana is drawn and delivers a killing blow in a single, blindingly fast motion. Modern tests with high-speed cameras have recorded trained iai jutsu practitioners completing this motion in under a quarter of a second. But here's something most people overlook. The samurai also carried a second blade, the wakizashi, a shorter companion sword, and often a tanto dagger as well. In close quarters, where the katana's length became a liability, the samurai could transition to shorter blades. And before we even get to sword range, let's not forget the bow. The samurai was, first and foremost, a mounted archer. The yumi, the asymmetric Japanese longbow, was the dominant weapon of samurai warfare for centuries. Viking warriors also used bows, but archery was not considered the prestigious warrior art in Norse culture that it was in Japan. Now, armor. This might be the single most important factor in this entire discussion. Viking armor is frequently misunderstood. In movies and television, Vikings wear elaborate horned helmets and complex metalwork. This is almost entirely fiction. Real Viking warriors wore simple iron or bronze helmets, usually without horns, sometimes with a nose guard. Body armor was a chainmail hauberk, a shirt of interlocking iron rings that covered the torso, shoulders, and upper arms. This was expensive. Not every Viking warrior owned chainmail. Many fought in thick padded leather or wool, relying on shields for primary defense. Chainmail is excellent protection against slashing attacks, but offers limited resistance to piercing thrusts. A Viking in full chainmail and helmet was reasonably well protected, but his face, hands, lower legs, and feet were largely exposed. Samurai armor, the o-yoroi of the early period and the more refined tosei gusoku of the later Sengoku era, is in an entirely different category of protection. A full suit of samurai armor covered virtually the entire body torso, shoulders, arms, hands, thighs, shins, and feet, with a full helmet including a face mask called a menpo that protected the face and throat. The armor used a combination of lacquered iron and leather plates laced together, which made it both remarkably strong and flexible enough to allow movement. The helmet, the kabuto, was particularly impressive, made of riveted iron plates with a sweeping neck guard. Tests of replica samurai armor have shown it can stop arrows at moderate range and deflect sword strikes that would penetrate European chainmail. In a direct armor comparison, the samurai has a significant advantage. More of his body is covered. The materials are comparable in quality. The design allows more mobility. A Viking striking a fully armored samurai would find far fewer exposed targets than a samurai striking a Viking. This is where the Viking's preferred weapon becomes crucial. The Dane axe, that massive, sweeping polearm, generates enough force to damage even well-constructed armor through concussive impact, even without penetrating it. A Viking axe strike to the chest might not cut through the samurai's lamellar plates, but the kinetic energy transmitted could still crack ribs, rupture organs, or simply stagger and unbalance an opponent in a way that creates the opening for a follow-up strike. The Viking fighting tradition understood this principle intuitively. Norse warriors regularly fought armored opponents and developed techniques for dealing with heavy armor through overwhelming force rather than precision. And now, right here, I want to stop for a second and ask you something. If you're watching this and you're enjoying it, if your brain is firing right now because you love this kind of deep historical content, please hit that subscribe button right now. We go this deep on every single topic, every video. Real research, real analysis, no fluff. The subscribe button is right there. It costs you nothing, and it means we can keep making content like this. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's get back to the fight. Because we haven't even talked about fighting philosophy yet, and this is where things get philosophically wild. The Viking approached combat with what scholars call a berserker mentality, and I don't mean that metaphorically. The berserkers were a real, documented class of Norse warriors who entered a trance-like state of combat fury, the WUD, the battle rage, that modern psychologists believe may have been a form of acute stress response that suppressed pain perception and amplified aggression. Historical accounts describe berserkers continuing to fight after sustaining wounds that should have been immediately debilitating. Whether this was a genuine neurological phenomenon, ritual drug use involving henbane or other psychoactive plants, or simply extreme psychological training is still debated. But the behavioral patterns are consistent across enough independent sources that historians take it seriously. A Viking warrior in full battle rage was not a rational, calculating fighter. He was a force of nature, attacking with wild ferocity, indifferent to pain, terrifying in his disregard for personal safety. The samurai's philosophical approach to combat was almost the exact opposite, and yet arrived at a similar result through completely different means. The concept of mushin, no mind, describes the ideal mental state for a samurai in combat, a complete absence of conscious thought, emotion, or fear, where the body moves entirely from trained instinct without the interference of the analytical mind. Mushin was cultivated through decades of meditation, Zen Buddhist practice, and repetitive drilling of techniques until they became entirely automatic. The samurai warrior was not supposed to think, "I will cut here." By the time that thought formed, the sword had already moved. Mushin and berserkergang are both states where normal fear and pain responses are overridden, but one is a controlled, trained emptiness, and the other is a consuming fire. Interestingly, both states make their practitioners extraordinarily dangerous and extremely difficult to fight using conventional psychological tactics like intimidation or feinting. You cannot intimidate a berserker because he's already beyond fear. You cannot feint against mushin because there's no analytical mind to deceive, only reflexes. Let's now consider the specific combat scenario with some historical grounding. Viking combat took place primarily in formation, the shield wall, and in raiding situations where the goal was rapid, violent, decisive action in confined spaces. Vikings excelled at short, explosive engagements, where overwhelming aggression settled matters quickly. They were less optimized for prolonged single combat duels, Though the Norse sagas document numerous holmgang duels, formalized single combat on a marked-out square, which suggests individual fighting ability, was very much valued and practiced. Samurai combat involved both large-scale battle formation tactics and highly formalized individual dueling, particularly from the Muromachi period onward. The tradition of Kengo, sword saint dueling, produced some of the most studied single combatants in human history. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the most famous samurai duelist in history, fought and won over 60 confirmed duels during his lifetime, many of them against multiple opponents simultaneously, and wrote a treatise on strategy, the Book of Five Rings, that is still studied by military strategists and business leaders today. Musashi's approach was deeply analytical. He wrote extensively about reading opponents, controlling timing, manipulating range, and using psychological pressure. This analytical tradition of individual combat was more developed in samurai culture than in Viking culture. Range management is a critical concept here. The Vikings' axe and sword combinations gave him flexibility in range, from long-reach axe sweeps to close-quarters grappling where the shorter seax knife came into play. The samurai's katana, while devastatingly effective at medium range, requires a specific distance to deploy optimally. Too close, and the long blade becomes a liability. But the samurai tradition accounts for this transitioning from katana to wakizashi in grappling range was standard practice. The samurai is arguably better prepared for range transitions because his entire training system is built around managing them. Now let's consider something that gets almost no attention in these discussions: combat experience and real-world violence exposure. This is uncomfortable, but necessary. Both Viking and samurai warriors experienced real combat. But the nature of that combat was different. A raiding Viking might participate in dozens of raids over a fighting career, violent, chaotic, short, brutal engagements against unprepared and terrified opponents. A samurai in a peaceful era of Japanese history might go an entire lifetime without drawing his sword against an actual opponent, his combat experience being almost entirely theoretical and practice-based. However, during periods of intense civil conflict, like the Sengoku period, samurai experienced continuous warfare across decades, fighting multiple battles per year. In those periods, a senior samurai warrior would have real combat experience comparable to or exceeding a Viking raider. The terrain and environment question is also worth examining. Vikings were ocean people. Their greatest battles were fought on beaches, in shallow water, on muddy riverbanks, in the tight corridors of raided monasteries and villages. They were comfortable in environments where footing was uncertain and conditions were miserable. Samurai fought primarily on dry land, fields, mountain passes, castle grounds, in environments more predictable and stable. This difference in environmental conditioning would matter in a duel fought on, say, a slippery winter deck or a muddy beach. But on neutral, stable ground, it becomes irrelevant. Let's also look at what happened historically when Japanese and European martial traditions actually encountered each other, because this happened, and the record is fascinating. Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch traders and soldiers came into contact with Japanese warriors during the 16th century. Contemporary European accounts describe Japanese sword technique as unlike anything they had encountered, faster, more precise, and more dangerous in close quarters than European fencing. European firearms, however, were quickly adopted by Japanese warlords because they could penetrate samurai armor. Norse weapons were primarily pre-gunpowder, but the Dane axe's force would present a similar armor-defeating problem. One more factor, the psychological element of fighting something genuinely unknown. A Viking had never seen a katana. A samurai had never seen a Dane axe. Both would be encountering a weapon style with no cultural context, no trained counter-responses, no instilled fear reflexes. This actually slightly favors the samurai. The tradition of mushin, of responding to the unexpected through pure trained reflex rather than analysis, is specifically designed for novel situations. The berserker state, while powerful, can be disrupted by truly unexpected stimuli that don't fit existing combat patterns. So who wins? Here is the honest, researched answer in the majority of direct one-on-one encounters under neutral conditions. A prime samurai warrior defeats a prime Viking warrior, but not by an overwhelming margin and with meaningful exceptions. The samurai's superior armor coverage reduces the Viking's most powerful attacks, those devastating axe blows that end fights in seconds. The samurai's speed and technical precision give him the ability to find the gaps in Viking armor, the face, the hands, the lower legs, with targeted, high-velocity cuts. The katana's cutting ability against chainmail in the gaps, particularly at the throat and wrist, is well documented in armor penetration tests. The samurai's training specifically addresses single combat dueling as a primary discipline, in a way that Viking martial culture does not. However, a Viking warrior with a great Dane axe at optimal range is genuinely dangerous to anyone, including a fully armored samurai. The axe's weight and reach, typically around 1.8 meters for a two-handed version, keeps a katana wielder at distance, and a direct hit anywhere, even on armored sections, transmits enough concussive force to potentially end or severely interrupt a fight. And the berserker psychological state is a genuine wildcard. A warrior who does not respond to pain, does not hesitate, and attacks with complete abandon is difficult to fight using technically optimal methods, because those methods often assume an opponent who responds predictably to threat and injury. The most accurate historical analogy comes from what we know about genuine martial effectiveness, technical skill, and superior equipment win most fights, but not all fights. And the Viking warrior, larger, physically more powerful, deeply combat experienced, fighting with weapons specifically designed to defeat armor through force, was not prey. He was a predator in his own right. The final verdict in 10 encounters, the samurai likely wins 7. The Viking wins 3, probably the ones where the axe finds its range first, or where the fight goes to the ground and raw strength becomes the dominant factor, or where the berserker state completely overrides the samurai's ability to use his technical advantages. That's not a samurai domination. That's a samurai edge. And there's an enormous difference between those two things. Both of these warriors were, in their own contexts, the most dangerous human beings on the planet. Both built cultures around the concept of the warrior as the highest human expression. Both died well by their own standards. The Viking, hopeful for Valhalla, the samurai accepting of the transience of life in the Buddhist tradition. They were brothers in steel who never got to meet. But if they did, if the fog rolled in on that beach and both men raised their weapons, history says bet on the sword. If you've made it to the end of this video, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You don't want shallow content. You want real, deep, honest dives into history, combat, and the things that actually matter. So do us a favor. Leave a comment below telling us who you think would win and why. Every comment genuinely helps the channel grow. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to independent creators like us. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button, turn on the bell, and join the community. We have more content exactly like this coming, and you don't want to miss it. See you in the next one.